Quiet little Danny. That's what they called her in the break room, the way people called things they thought were harmless. She'd been called worse in Sangin, but not by people who claimed to heal. Danielle Ross had learned 3 years ago that there were different kinds of invisible, and the most dangerous kind looked like gratitude for working the shifts nobody wanted. They didn't know her hands had sutured 73 combat casualties in a field hospital that still stood, if only barely. They didn't know she'd held a lieutenant's intestines in place for 6 minutes while artillery hammered the roof. What happened when that past came walking through the ER doors in a black body bag on a stretcher would change everything. But first, there was coffee. There was always coffee. Oak Creek Memorial in Norfolk had the particular smell of every trauma hospital in America, antiseptic and copper and something underneath that wasn't quite masked, the scent of bodies pushed past their limits. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant burn, and Danielle moved through the ICU corridors with the kind of practiced invisibility that came from making yourself small enough not to be noticed. Her scrubs were 2 sizes too big, deliberately. Her hair pulled back so tight it created a permanent crease across her forehead. The limp was harder to hide, so she simply didn't sit. 7 hours into her shift, she'd already started 3/4s on patients with collapsed veins, positioned a post-op hip replacement to reduce swelling, and made sure Mrs. Chen in room for 12 had her pain meds before the shaking started. Mrs. Chen had squeezed her hand. "You move like you know exactly what you're doing," the woman had whispered. Danielle had changed her bag and not responded. In the ICU charting station, the monitors beeped their steady rhythm, the sound of people still here, still breathing, still fighting. Danielle's hands moved across the keyboard with the same precision she'd learned under fire, each keystroke efficient, no wasted motion. Dr. Caldwell stood at the far end of the nurses' station, his white coat pristine, his silver hair catching the overhead lights like something that had been polished. He was watching her. She knew this without looking up from the monitor, the way she'd learned to know things in Sangin, peripheral awareness, the sense of being calculated. Chief of surgery didn't usually track the movement of floor nurses. But Caldwell did. His eyes had that particular quality of someone assessing value, the way a jeweler looks at a stone he suspects might be flawed. She closed the chart and stood, and that's when her lower back sent its familiar warning, a tight coil of scar tissue and nerve damage that had never quite healed right. The shrapnel had done what it was designed to do, entered, fragmented, destroyed. She'd been lucky. That's what they told her 3 years ago at Walter Reed, before they'd medically discharged her and handed her a business card for vocational rehabilitation. They told her she was lucky to walk. She did walk. She just never mentioned to anyone that it felt like walking on a fault line. The break room was empty except for the hum of the refrigerator. Danielle opened her locker, and there it was, the photo of David in his marine dress blues, his face serious in a way that still made her chest tight. 2nd Lieutenant David Ross, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. Behind the photo sat a dying succulent, brown at the edges, because even plants reflected her current state. And wedged at the back, something she'd never fully explained to herself, an MRE wrapper from an old operational readiness exercise, the one where she'd used it as a makeshift chest seal when a trainee had taken shrapnel to the thorax. Old habits. She took a pull of cold coffee from yesterday and was about to head back to the ICU when the alert system kicked in. Incoming trauma. Incoming trauma. 5 minutes. The overhead intercom crackled dead. Danielle's cup paused halfway to her lips. Incoming meant the ER doors would open, meant the organized chaos of blood and urgency, meant everything she'd spent 3 years learning how to avoid by becoming invisible. She set the coffee down and moved. Not fast. Never visibly fast. Just purposeful, the way a trained person moves when the environment requires it. The kind of movement that doesn't call attention to itself because it's so economical there's nothing to notice. The trauma bay was already in motion when she arrived. 2 nurses prepping beds, a resident pulling supplies, someone calling out pressure cuff readings. The ER doors burst open with the sound of wheels on tile and raised voices, and the stretcher came through like something that had been launched at speed. Military transport, she registered. Black fatigues, 2 personnel in tactical gear riding alongside the gurney. The patient's chest was wrapped in improvised bandaging, blood still seeping through. Abdominal wounds, at least 2 that she could see. The resident was already calling out vitals, weak femoral pulse, respiration shallow, Glasgow score dropping. 5 bullet wounds. The transport medic was saying it clearly. 5 GSWs, chest and abdomen, sustained during an engagement 40 minutes prior, emergency evac by Halo to Bethesda, transferred to Norfolk for surgical intervention because Bethesda was overloaded. The words came rapid and professional, the kind of medical shorthand spoken between people who'd seen trauma before breakfast. And then she saw it. The dog tag. Single tag on a broken chain, hanging off the patient's neck at an angle where normal dog tags wouldn't hang, the metal catching the light of the trauma bay. The insignia was unusual, not the standard Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor. This was something else. Something classified. Something she'd seen exactly once before, in a letter from David that had contained exactly 1 photograph before she'd burned it for operational security reasons. The unit patch from his commanding officer's file. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes. Her son's commanding officer. The man who had signed off on David's deployment into Sangin Valley. The man whose name appeared in the official casualty reports as the ranking officer on the FOB when the compound was hit. Her breath stopped. Not visibly. Nobody was looking at her, they were focused on the monitor that now showed a heart rate of 148 and climbing, blood pressure dropping through the floor like a stone down a well. But internally, something shifted. The room became very clear. The fluorescent light seemed to sharpen. The monitor beep separated into individual sounds instead of a rhythm. Pain was information. That's what they taught you. Pain tells you where the damage is. This feeling, this was information too. Dr. Caldwell materialized at the bedside like something that had been waiting for this exact moment. His presence had that quality of a predator sensing disturbance in the water. He was already assigning tasks, his voice cutting through the organized chaos with practiced authority. 2 large bore lines. Type O negative, unlock the blood bank. Get me imaging, I need to know where these rounds stopped. His eye scanned the patient, cataloging damage, already planning the intervention. This was competence. This was a surgeon at work. But then his gaze shifted, just for a moment, from the patient to her face. To the exact position where Danielle stood, and where she'd been staring at the dog tag long enough to register. His eyes narrowed. Not in anger. In calculation. The expression of someone who'd just seen a piece of a puzzle move into unexpected alignment. Danielle looked away first. That was part of the invisibility. Know when to drop the gaze. Know when to become background again. She moved to the footstand and started setting up the second line, her hands moving with the kind of steadiness that came from having done this before. Not in a hospital. Not under fluorescent lights with monitors and blood banks and proper trauma protocols. Under canvas, in a tent that shook with artillery, with rounds coming through the walls and nothing but muscle memory and training between a young Marine and exsanguination. Her fingers found the tourniquet, wrapped it, felt for the vein. The needle went in smooth. No hesitation. No tremor. The 3 years since Sangin had given her hands time to forget the details but not the skill. Muscle memory was like that. It didn't care about discharge papers or vocational rehabilitation or moving to Norfolk and working night shifts under fluorescent lights. Her body remembered. Her hands knew exactly what they were doing. They always had. Get me an update on his status, Caldwell was saying, and the resident rattled off numbers, BP 68 systolic, O2 sat dropping to 82, heart rate now pushing 160. The patient's chest was barely moving. Flail segment probably, maybe a pneumothorax. Maybe worse. Danielle hung the second liter and moved to check the first line, her movements efficient, her presence already fading back into the background where nobody looked too closely at the quiet nurse in the oversized scrubs. But Caldwell was still watching her. She felt it the way she'd felt watchers in Sangin, a weight, a presence, a calculation happening behind someone's eyes. He'd seen something. The question was whether he'd understood what he'd seen, or if that moment of recognition was just professional curiosity about an oddly competent floor nurse who clearly knew how to handle a trauma. Either way, the next few minutes would matter. Either way, something had shifted in Oak Creek Memorial the moment that dog tag came through the ER doors. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. 3 times. The rhythm steady but fast, a heart trying very hard not to stop. Danielle checked her line and stepped back into the invisible space where she'd learned to live. Around her, the trauma team moved in their organized choreography. The attending surgeon barked orders. The residents scrambled. The nurses called out vitals. And in the middle of it all, a man with a broken chain around his neck fought to keep breathing, not knowing that the floor nurse who'd just started his FA had once held the record for most lives saved under fire in Marine Corps history. Not knowing that his commanding officer, David's commanding officer, was finally close enough to save. The overhead speaker crackled at 2:17 p.m., the sound cutting through the usual hospital white noise like a siren through fog. Quiet little Danny to the administrator's office. Quiet little Danny to administration. The page echoed twice more, deliberate in its repetition, in the way it lingered in the air like a slur. Danielle Ross stood outside Trauma Bay 3, watching through the reinforced glass as Dr. Caldwell worked on Commander Marcus Hayes. His hands moved with practiced precision, but his jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with the medicine. He'd seen her watching. He'd seen the moment she recognized the broken chain around the commander's neck, the same insignia that appeared in her son's letters from the Helmand province, the same unit patch she'd memorized from photographs taken in Sangin where the heat shimmered like a living thing and men bled in the sand. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn as Danielle turned from the trauma bay. The floor nurses at the station exchanged glances, quick, practiced smirks that had been perfected over 3 years of watching the quiet floor nurse move through Oak Creek Memorial like she was apologizing for her own existence. One of them, Katie, muttered just loud enough to carry, "Wonder what she did wrong this time." Another nurse, younger, laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all week. Danielle took one measured breath. Just one. The kind of breath that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere trained, somewhere that had learned long ago that breathing was tactical, that composure was currency, that showing nothing was the only power left to her. A single tear escaped. She didn't blink. Didn't waver. She wiped it with the back of her hand while holding eye contact with Katie for exactly 2 seconds longer than comfortable, then walked toward the elevators with her head level and her spine straight. The smile stopped the moment she turned away. The administrator's office occupied the corner of the 4th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Norfolk waterfront, the James River glinting like scattered silver in the afternoon light. Dr. Caldwell stood by the window, not sitting, never sitting. Standing was dominance. Standing was the posture of someone who controlled the room simply by refusing to make himself smaller. He was tall in the way that some men cultivated, shoulders broad enough to cast a shadow, the kind of presence that arrived before he did. His tie was silk. His watch was a Rolex Daytona. His fingernails were manicured. "I saw you staring," he said without preamble, not bothering with greeting or courtesy. "The commander. You know him personally." Danielle kept her voice steady, the way you do when you're threading a needle in bad light. "He's my son's commanding officer." Caldwell's expression shifted. Not surprise, he'd already guessed, but something colder than that. Clinical. The way a doctor looked at an infection he was about to eliminate. Then you understand why you can't be anywhere near his case. Professional boundaries, Danielle. We have protocols for exactly this situation. Staff with personal connections to patients create liability. Emotional compromise. You're too. He paused, selecting the word like he was choosing a weapon. Emotionally fragile for this level of care. She said nothing. The silence in the office was so thick it had weight. Thunder rolled across the city outside, the kind that comes before a storm, before the sky opens up and forgets how to close again. Your performance has been concerning, Caldwell continued, moving back to his desk. Papers were already arrayed there, her evaluations, printed and highlighted in yellow. Slow response times. Hesitation in emergency situations. Honestly, Danielle, I'm surprised you've made it this long at Oak Creek. Most nurses your age with your condition, they move to administrative positions. Easier. Less pressure. He smiled like he was offering her a gift. I'm moving you to the geriatric wing. Night shift. Effective immediately. You'll work with the nursing home patients, the end-of-life cases. No trauma, no emergency situations. Just quiet, manageable patients who won't be frightened by your... He gestured vaguely at her. Your limitations. That night, at 6:36 p.m., Danielle found her locker assignment changed. Her name badge had been reprinted. Geriatric unit. Night shift. The new assignment sheet was waiting in the supply closet when she went to restock linens at the end of her shift, the one she'd worked for 3 years without incident, without complaint, without asking for anything except the chance to be useful. The closet was narrow, shelves crowding in like walls, the smell of detergent and bleach mixing in the recycled air. The door closed behind her? Not slammed. Closed. Soft. Which was somehow worse. Dr. Caldwell blocked the exit. The supply closet suddenly felt like a room with only one way out, and he was standing in it. His voice was surgical, precise, the way you'd speak to someone who'd already stopped mattering. The commander's case is complicated. High profile. There are inconsistencies in his transfer paperwork, questions about pre-hospital care, about who had access to him. And I can't have a floor nurse with personal connections asking those kinds of questions. You understand? I haven't asked any questions, Danielle said. Her voice was level. Flat. The voice of someone who'd learned that emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford. And you won't. He stepped closer. The space between them became a pressure, not a threat, not yet, but something with the potential to become one. You're being transferred to night shift in geriatrics, effective now. You'll work with patients who won't remember your name by morning, who won't require emergency interventions, who won't have any connection to high-profile cases or military personnel. And if you mention the commander's case to anyone, Danielle, a single person, I'll make sure you never work nursing again. I'll call the state medical board. I'll file complaints. I'll make sure that no hospital within 100 miles will hire you. You'll be done. Finished. Do you understand me? One measured breath. The kind that came from the place in her chest where she'd learned to put pain, to file it away like data, to convert it into something useful. One tear escaped. She let it happen. Didn't look away. Met his eyes with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived things he couldn't imagine. The kind of calm that came from holding a bleeding Marine's hand as his breath got shallow, from packing wounds with whatever was available, from watching the life leave eyes that had been laughing 30 seconds before. My son trusted that man with his life, Danielle said quietly. Each word fell like a stone into still water. You won't stop me from returning the favor. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to resistance from the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones who moved through the hospital like ghosts apologizing for taking up space. He stepped back, and the door opened, and she left the supply closet with her assignment changed and her heart steady and her hands completely still. The next evening, at 5:42 p.m. during shift change, Caldwell found her in the parking lot. 6 other nurses were arriving, fresh-faced day shift staff heading out, night shift coming in, that shift change moment when the hospital exhaled and inhaled with different people. He intercepted her by her car, his voice carrying across the asphalt in a way he knew would be heard. Danielle, I've been reviewing your evaluations, he said, loud enough for the nurses arriving to pause. Your recent performance is concerning. Slow response times. Hesitation in emergency situations. We've had complaints from staff about your attitude. He let that sit in the air like a stain. The geriatric transfer is for your own good. And for patient safety. The other nurses stared. Danielle's hands didn't shake as she adjusted her bag strap. She took one measured breath. She met his eyes with the kind of quiet devastation that only comes from watching people you love get hurt, from being powerless to stop it, from having to smile and say thank you while your insides are burning. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that he had to lean closer to hear her, which meant the others couldn't quite make out the words. "I've never lost a patient on my watch, doctor. Can you say the same?" The silence lasted 3 seconds. That was all it took. He walked away without responding, which meant she'd won, which meant she'd just made an enemy who controlled her schedule, her reputation, and the only job she'd been able to get with a medical discharge and a spine that hurt when it rained. She watched him disappear into the main entrance, then got into her car and gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. The photograph of David in his marine dress blue sat on her dashboard, his smile the same smile he'd had at 4 years old when he believed she could fix anything. She was still sitting in the parking lot when her phone buzzed at 9:37 p.m. A text from Kelly Chen, an ICU nurse she'd trained with back when Danielle had been someone important, someone who'd known exactly what to do in an emergency. The message read, "Commander crashing. Caldwell restricted who can treat him. Something's wrong." Danielle stared at the words. The photograph of David stared back at her. She closed her eyes and saw something else, a letter dated 6 months ago, her son's handwriting, words she'd read so many times the paper was soft at the folds. "Commander Hayes is the real deal, Mom. He brought 3 guys out under fire last month. You'd like him. I trust him with my life." At 2:04 a.m., the code blue alarm screamed through Oak Creek Memorial like a living thing. Danielle was in the geriatric wing, checking on Mrs. Patterson in room for 12, an 87-year-old with pneumonia and no family who'd visited in 6 weeks. The siren made the old woman's eyes flutter. Danielle squeezed her hand, whispered something about it being okay, and her feet moved before her conscious mind caught up. She ran, actually ran, her limp more pronounced under stress, adrenaline overriding the shrapnel-damaged nerve in her hip that had ended her first career. The ICU was 3 floors up. She took the stairs. The fluorescent lights blurred past. Her heart beat in combat rhythm, the kind she'd learned in Sangin, in the Taliban-controlled areas where helicopters came at dawn and the only thing between dying and surviving was speed and training and the willingness to break every rule. She stopped outside Trauma Bay 1. The glass was cool under her palm. Through it, she saw Commander Marcus Hayes convulsing on the table, monitors shrieking their electronic panic, the oxygen saturation numbers dropping like a stone through water. 74, 68. 62, a resident, young, handshaking, reached for the defibrillator, but the real problem was obvious to anyone who'd spent 18 months treating combat trauma in the Hindu Kush. The chest wasn't rising correctly. The breath sounds were absent on the right side. Tension pneumothorax. The same presentation she'd seen in a 12-year-old Marine named Rodriguez whose lungs had collapsed in the Sangin marketplace before the medevac arrived. She'd kept him talking. Kept him conscious. Kept him alive long enough to get to the surgical tent. Kelly caught Danielle's eye through the window. Mouthed, "Help." Dr. Caldwell appeared at the end of the hallway, moving fast, phone to his ear, and the calculation happened in Danielle's mind in less than 1 second. She had maybe 90 seconds before he reached the trauma bay. Before he could stop her. Before he could protect whatever he was protecting. She pushed the door open. Muscle memory took over. 3 years of invisible work evaporated. 23 years of being someone important, someone trained, someone trusted with lives in the worst conditions imaginable, all of it rose up like water behind a broken dam. She was assessing breath sounds before anyone could stop her, her fingers on his ribs, checking for tracheal deviation, the right side of his chest dull to percussion in that terrible way that meant the space between lung and chest wall had filled with air under pressure. A pneumothorax that was collapsing the lung, compressing the heart, stealing his oxygen 1 second at a time. "He needs immediate decompression," she said, and her voice had changed. It dropped half an octave. It carried command authority that made the resident step back without question, that made Kelly move to gather supplies, that sounded like someone who'd spent 1,000 nights making decisions that meant the difference between breathing and not breathing. "Get me a 14-gauge needle," Danielle said. "Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Now." The geriatric ward at 2 in the morning moves at the speed of failing organs. Danielle checks the pulse oximeter on Mrs. Chen in room for 12, pneumonia settling into both lower lobes like a predator that had already won half the battle. Oxygen sat at 87%. Danielle adjusts the nasal cannula, watching the numbers climb. 89. 91. The old woman's breathing steadies. In room for 16, Mr. Patel has been staring at the ceiling for 18 minutes straight, his left hip still wrapped in compression bandages from the fall 3 days ago. He doesn't acknowledge her presence. Danielle checks his vitals without speaking. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate regular. Pain management adequate. She makes a note and moves to the next door, the next patient, the next quiet contribution to a night shift that feels designed specifically to erase her from memory. The ward is quiet in that particular way that hospitals are quiet at 2:30 in the morning, not peaceful, but exhausted. The fluorescent lights buzz their endless, maddening song. Machines beep in programmed intervals. Somewhere down the hall, an elderly man coughs into the darkness. Danielle has been walking this floor for 6 hours. 6 hours of invisible work. 6 hours of being nobody to everyone. This is what Caldwell wanted. This is what he manufactured. Push the decorated combat medic down to the basement floor where nobody asks questions and nobody notices. Her phone buzzes against her thigh. The message from Kelly in the ICU hits like a defibrillator shock, his crashing. Caldwell's on-call surgeon isn't picking up. For tries. Hayes is going septic fast. His BP just dropped to 68/40. Where is Caldwell? Danielle reads the message 3 times. Her hand doesn't shake. Her breathing doesn't quicken. Instead, something else happens, a crystalline clarity that feels like waking up after 3 years of sleeping. The pieces align. Caldwell didn't just send her to geriatrics to humiliate her. He sent her here to keep her out of the way. He orchestrated this. An on-call surgeon doesn't simply vanish. A surgeon doesn't ignore for emergency pages unless someone has made a very specific phone call. Hayes is crashing, and the trauma bay is empty of the only people qualified to save him. Except it isn't. Danielle moves. No hesitation. No internal debate. The decision is already made, has been made since the moment she recognized that dog tag 4 hours ago. She steps into the supply closet and changes her badge from the geriatric ward to a borrowed OR credential she palmed during shift change, a tactical decision made without thinking because this decision is muscle memory too. In Sangin, when the field hospital burned, she didn't ask permission either. She moved. Everyone alive because she moved. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor takes 40 seconds. It feels like 4 minutes. Her heart rate hasn't changed. Her hands are steady. The combat medic inside her, the one Caldwell thinks she buried, opens her eyes. The trauma bay doors slide open and the crisis is immediate, total, undeniable. Commander Marcus Hayes lies on the surgical bed, his monitor screaming a warning that sounds like an accelerating heartbeat nobody can catch. 80. 105. 122. His skin has taken on a grayish tone that means his body is shutting down. Shock. Massive septic shock. Blood pressure 68/38 and still falling. His chest moves in short, desperate gasps. Kelly sees Danielle and her eyes widen with something between hope and recognition. She knows what Danielle is, somehow, and she knows why she came. What's his current antibiotic coverage? Danielle's voice doesn't belong to the nurse who's been checking vitals on the geriatric floor. This voice comes from someone who has stood over wounded Marines while mortars landed 200 yards away and kept talking in exactly this tone because the talking is the only thing keeping them conscious. Broad spectrum. Vancomycin, Piperacillin since 2200. Kelly answers without questioning why a geriatric floor nurse is asking surgical questions. The infection is moving through his bloodstream like fire through dry grass. Hayes's monitor drops again. 115. 108. 100. The line is descending toward a flat line that will come in moments if nobody intervenes. Danielle sees the ventilator pushing oxygen into lungs that can't process it, sees the central line draining fluid that should be staying in his vessels, sees the infection spreading through his body like a tactical maneuver executed by an enemy she can actually fight. The trauma bay door explodes open and Dr. Caldwell enters, his surgical mask already on, his gloved hands raised in surgical position. Then he sees Danielle and his entire body goes rigid. "What are you doing in my trauma bay? You're not authorized to be on this floor. I transferred you to geriatrics. You shouldn't even have access to this section of the hospital." His voice carries the precision of someone whose power has been built entirely on the ability to control space and people and circumstances. He sees her standing at the monitor, her hand already moving to check Hayes's peripheral force, and something shifts in his expression, calculation hardening into rage. Danielle doesn't look at him. She's looking at Hayes, at the monitor, at the numbers that are telling her exactly what's happening in his body. A tension pneumothorax, the kind that can develop when bullet wounds rupture internal structures. His right lung is collapsing. His heart is being compressed by the buildup of air in his thoracic cavity. He has perhaps 90 seconds before cardiac arrest. She has fewer words than that to explain it. Tension pneumothorax. Danielle's voice is level, factual, the voice of someone delivering information to people who should understand its implications. Approximately 90 seconds before full cardiac arrest. He needs needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, immediately. Caldwell moves toward her, his motion sharp and aggressive. "You're a floor nurse. You don't make those calls. You don't diagnose. You don't stay in this room. Get out." It's not a request. It's a command delivered by someone who has never been challenged inside these walls, whose authority has calcified into something he believes is absolute. Hayes's lips are turning blue. Cyanosis spreading like a shadow across his mouth and the edges of his nostrils. His oxygen saturation drops to 71%. The monitor shows a heart rate that's climbing because the muscle is working harder and harder against an increasing load it cannot overcome. Caldwell reaches for her arm, his gloved hand closing around the sleeve of her scrubs. "If you touch this patient, I will have you arrested for assault and practicing medicine without a license. I will personally ensure that you never work in any hospital anywhere in this country ever again. Do you understand me?" His breath comes through the mask, hot and certain. He believes he can stop her with words and the threat of professional destruction. He has no idea who he's threatening. Danielle looks at him for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, she measures the distance between them and the crash cart. She calculates whether Caldwell is actually willing to physically restrain her or whether his power is only effective when delivered through institutional channels. She assesses that he will freeze because people who have never actually fought always freeze when confronted with someone who has. Then she speaks, and her voice drops an octave, the voice of someone who has been holding back a very specific kind of gravity for 3 years. "Then arrest me after I save his life." She moves the way apex predators move, not with aggression, but with absolute intention. Her body shifts between Caldwell and the crash cart. Kelly slaps a 14-gauge needle into her palm. Caldwell's hand falls away from her arm because she is no longer a floor nurse he can control through administrative authority. She is something else entirely. She is a Marine officer in scrubs. She is someone who has already made the decision and is simply executing it now. The needle goes in at the 4th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the insertion point that will find the air pocket destroying Hayes's thorax. Danielle's hands move like they've done this hundreds of times because they have. The rush of escaping air follows immediately, a hiss that sounds like pressure releasing, like a lung reinflating, like time slowing down just enough to save his life. Hayes gasps. His oxygen saturation climbs. 82%. 87%. The monitor that was descending toward flatline now stabilizes, his heart rate dropping from lethal speed toward something that might actually let him survive the next minute. But the pneumothorax isn't the only crisis. The bullet wound to his right thorax is still weeping blood, still introducing air into spaces where air shouldn't be. Danielle packs the wound with gauze, feeling the edges of the tissue that should have been sutured days ago, that should have been covered with proper dressing. She reaches into her pocket, the one item she's carried since her medical discharge 3 years ago, and pulls out a plastic MRE wrapper, weathered and creased from 3 years of being pressed against her body as a reminder of what she was. She places it over the wound and uses medical tape from the crash cart to create a seal that will hold until proper surgical repair. The kind of seal she created 73 times in Sangin while bullets painted patterns on the walls around her. The resident physician stands frozen, watching a geriatric floor nurse perform emergency surgical intervention with the precision of someone who has done this under conditions infinitely worse than an adequately lit trauma bay. His mouth moves but no words emerge. Caldwell's face has drained entirely of color. The rage returns a moment later, flooding through him like something he's never experienced before, the rage of someone whose absolute authority has just been shattered by a person he considered powerless. "You just performed surgery." Caldwell's voice carries the shock of someone watching his entire world restructure. "You, a floor nurse, just cut into a patient. You performed a procedure. You exceeded your scope of practice. Security. I want security to this trauma bay now. I want her removed from this hospital immediately, and I want assault charges filed against her." He's shouting now, the clinical composure cracking, because he understands that something has gone catastrophically wrong with his plan. Security arrives in 30 seconds. Danielle doesn't resist. She steps back from the monitor, her hands still steady, her breathing still controlled. Hayes's vital signs stabilize. His oxygen saturation climbs to 94%. His blood pressure rises to 82/51. His heart rate drops to 112. The numbers that were spelling his death are now spelling his survival. She watches the monitor for 3 more seconds, confirming the trajectory, then she turns away to face the 2 security officers in their uniforms and their expressions of confusion about what's happening and who they're supposed to remove. But Hayes's hand moves. Weakly, slowly, like every muscle in his body has been defeated by infection and trauma, his arm lifts from the bed. His fingers extend toward the space where Danielle stood. His lips move, forming words so quiet that only Kelly hears them, and Kelly's eyes widen with understanding. One word. Barely a whisper. But it carries the weight of everything: recognition, gratitude, the acknowledgement of someone saved by someone who understands exactly what it means to owe a life. Angel. The security officers hesitate, their hands on her arms uncertain now, because they've just watched someone save a patient's life and now they're being ordered to arrest her for it. The trauma bay goes so quiet you can hear the ventilator hiss, the monitor beep, the fluorescent lights buzz their endless song. Danielle walks between them toward the doors, her hands uncuffed, her composure perfect, her face betraying nothing of the 3 years of invisibility ending in this moment. She's being removed from the hospital. She's being charged with assault and practicing medicine without a license. She's losing her career because she chose to save a man's life. But Hayes is alive. The commander is alive. And in the silence that follows her exit, Kelly looks down at the monitor and realizes she's holding the hand of someone who just received medical intervention from someone whose call sign he remembers from briefing papers about the Sangin Field Hospital. The papers about the medic who pulled 12 Marines from a burning structure while under direct fire. The papers about the officer whose official status reads medically discharged but whose actual status belongs to an entirely different category, the kind of person who comes back when it matters. The monitor flatlined at 0147. One long, unbroken wail of absence. Dr. Caldwell was 3 floors away when the alarm screamed through the overhead system, but Danielle heard it the way a dog hears a frequency humans can't reach. She was stocking the geriatric supply closet, hands moving mechanically through bandages and wound dressings, when every muscle in her body recognized that sound as belonging to Commander Hayes. She didn't think. Thinking was for people with choices. Her legs were moving before her mind caught up, down the stairwell at a pace that would have looked desperate to anyone watching, but Danielle moved like a woman retrieving something she'd lost, not someone running toward danger. The trauma bay doors opened before she reached them. Kelly caught her wrist. "Danny, you can't," but Danielle was already past her, already moving into the controlled chaos of a code in progress. Hayes lay on the bed like a man made of broken machinery, his chest heaving with the mechanical desperation of a body trying to keep itself alive without permission from his brain. The resident working the code was losing. Danielle could see it in the slack angle of his shoulders, the mechanical way he was compressing a chest that was already drowning itself in fluid. No one was thinking. Everyone was following protocol. Protocol was killing him. Danielle moved to the crash cart in 3 steps. Her hands knew exactly which drawer, which instrument. The scalpel was cold and familiar in her grip, not like a tool but like a word in a language she'd sworn never to speak again. She didn't ask permission. Permission was a luxury for people who had time. "Move," she said, and the resident startled backward as though her voice had physical weight. She pressed the blade to the space between Hayes's ribs, the 4th intercostal space, mid-axillary line. The coordinates burned into something deeper than memory. The skin split like tissue paper. Blood released itself like a confession. Her hands moved on their own, the kind of muscle memory that lived in the nervous system itself, in the cells that had done this 100 times in a field tent in Sangin with dust coating every surface and the sound of incoming fire making the whole structure shake. She exposed the lung. The wound was catastrophic. The bullet had created a cavity, a void that was filling with blood faster than the body could process it. She packed gauze into the cavity with the methodical precision of someone who understood that panic killed faster than bullets. 4 packages of hemostatic gauze. 5. The blood kept coming. There was no surgeon. There was only this, the moment between drowning and breathing. From her locker, a voice in her head said, "The MRE wrapper." She'd carried them for 3 years, the same way some women carried photographs. Danielle reached into her scrub pocket without breaking focus and pulled out the emergency chest seal packet she'd kept, the one labeled for sucking chest wounds, for the spaces between death and intervention. Her fingers tore the backing open. The plastic went over the hole. The seal caught. Air stopped rushing out. For the first time since the monitor flatlined, the ventilator began doing its job instead of fighting the patient's own lungs. O2 sat rising. Someone whispered. 72, 74, 78. The next voice she heard wasn't surprise or gratitude. It was authority, and it carried the temperature of a walk-in freezer. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway, his face cycling through emotions like a man watching something he'd carefully arranged fall sideways. He looked at her hands, still deep in Hayes's chest cavity, looked at the vitals climbing on the monitor, and instead of relief, there was something else. Calculation. Threat assessment. The kind of cold that comes from realizing you've been outmaneuvered by someone you decided was invisible. He crossed the room in 4 strides and physically pulled Danielle away from the bedside with a force that sent her stumbling backward. Her bloody hands reached for the counter to catch herself. The image was explosive. Major Danielle Ross, the woman who'd held together 12 Marines in a collapsing field hospital, suddenly looking like exactly what Caldwell wanted everyone to see, a nurse who'd overstepped, who'd broken protocol, who'd assaulted a patient in violation of every institutional boundary. "You're a floor nurse, not a surgeon," Caldwell's voice cut through the trauma bay like a scalpel itself. "Security, remove her from this hospital immediately." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the kind of certainty that comes from institutional power, the certainty of a man who'd spent his career learning that credentials matter more than competence, that titles carry more weight than hands that had held life itself together. The security guards came fast. 2 of them, moving with the efficiency of men who'd done this before, who didn't ask questions when a physician gave an order. Danielle didn't resist. Resistance would have meant drawing more attention to Hayes, more scrutiny, more risk. She let them guide her toward the door, but her eye stayed locked on the commander's face, watching his chest rise and fall with the rhythm she'd restored. The bag valve mask kept timing with his breathing, mechanical now, but alive. Alive because she'd moved. Alive because 5 years ago someone had taught her how to hold what mattered in the space between heartbeats. The walk through the hallway felt longer than it was. Every floor nurse they passed stared. Kelly followed at a distance, her face a study in controlled rage. In the locker room, the guard standing at the door while Danielle packed what remained of her life into a cardboard box, the cracked mug that said "World's Best Mom" in faded letters, the dying succulent that David had given her, the photograph of her son in dress blues, chest out, before the war had written its own story across his face. Kelly appeared in the doorway. The guard didn't stop her. "Danny," she said, and her voice was the kind of quiet that carried decisions. "He's asking for someone. Keep saying it over and over. Angel 6. He wants Angel 6. She stepped forward and pressed something into Danielle's palm, the commander's dog tag on the broken chain, the unit insignia visible even in the fluorescent light. The same insignia from David's letters. The same symbol that meant Danielle had given her son to a man, and now that man owed her a debt she'd just paid in blood and improvised supplies. "He wanted you to have it," Kelly whispered. The security escort walked her through the lobby at 0300. The rain had started sometime during the code, the kind of rain that came down like judgment, like the sky was finally catching up with everything that had happened down on Earth. Past the night shift nurses who whispered and stared. Past the vending machines with their harsh light. Past the automatic doors that slid open as though the hospital itself was finally releasing her. Outside, the rain soaked through her scrubs within seconds. There was no shelter at the bus stop, just a broken bench and a metal covering that had rusted through to uselessness. She stood there clutching the cardboard box, the sum of 18 years of nursing, reduced to what fit in her arms. The commander's dog tag burned in her pocket next to her own, the one she hadn't worn since the medical discharge 3 years ago. The discharge that called it medical separation. The discharge that didn't mention Sangin. The discharge that didn't mention the field hospital, the shrapnel, the moment when a bomb had torn through a structure and the major inside had been medically broken just enough to be sent home, but not quite broken enough to stop being the person she was. Her phone buzzed. "David." A text from a time zone away. "Mom, I got emergency leave. Commander Hayes' team called me. I'm flying in tomorrow. Call me when you land." She didn't land anywhere. She was still standing at a bus stop in Norfolk at 3 in the morning, watching rain blur the headlights into abstract art, watching her breath fog in the cold, watching the life she'd built out of invisibility come apart in a cardboard box. Inside the hospital, on the 3rd floor, Dr. Caldwell stood at his office window and watched her bus pull away. Then he made a phone call. His voice was smooth, assured, the voice of a man who understood institutional power and how to weaponize it. "Yes, I need to report a former employee who assaulted a patient. I want charges filed before she can spin this narrative. She attacked a surgeon's patient in the middle of a code. Definitely grounds for loss of licensure." What he didn't know, what he was still incapable of knowing, was that Kelly had already made a different phone call. To a Navy SEAL on the commander's protection detail. A man whose job was understanding threats and responding to them. A man whose phone calls reached places where Dr. Caldwell's institutional power meant nothing at all. The kind of places where a major meant something entirely different than what it said on a medical discharge form. The rain kept falling. The cardboard box kept getting wet. And somewhere in a city 3,000 miles away, a Marine major was already moving, the machinery of the military's most invisible apparatus grinding to life with quiet, terrifying efficiency. She moved through the emergency entrance during shift change, when the chaos of departing nurses masked the arrival of those who shouldn't be there. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as she slipped past the security desk. The guard was helping an elderly woman find radiology, his eyes pointed anywhere but the corridor. Her cardboard box was gone now, replaced by purpose. The rain-soaked parking lot had been 4 hours ago. Her wet clothes had dried. Her hands had stopped shaking. What remained was muscle memory and a dog tag burning in her pocket like a coal that wouldn't cool. The ICU corridor smelled like antiseptic and the ghost of someone spilled coffee. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. She'd learned that skill in a field hospital where noise meant incoming fire. Room for 12. The door was cracked open, and inside, the monitors beat their steady rhythm, oxygen holding, heart rate climbing, the sound of someone waking. She didn't knock. She never knocked. She moved like water finding its level, and when Commander Hayes's eyes opened and found her face in the semi-darkness, something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Muscle memory of his own. "Angel 6, he whispered. Not a question. A salute delivered in 2 words. "You're Angel 6. The door burst open behind her. David in his marine dress blues, still creased from emergency leave, his uniform catching the hallway light. He stopped short, seeing his mother at the bedside of his commanding officer at 2:22 a.m. created a mathematics his brain couldn't solve. His voice cracked with something between shock and the kind of understanding that rewires everything a person thought they knew. "Mom. The commander said you saved him, but he called you Major." The room went dead silent. Even the monitors seemed to soften their beeping. A floor nurse appeared in the doorway, the same one who'd witnessed the chest seal surgery, who'd slipped Danielle the dog tag in the darkness of the trauma bay. Her hands trembled as she held a classified file, the kind with red borders and stamped warnings that civilian hospitals weren't supposed to possess. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, the words shaking like leaves in wind. "It says here she performed 73 combat surgeries in Sangin." That the nurse couldn't finish. She handed the file to David, who read it with the careful attention of someone decoding a language he'd always spoken but never fully understood. The file grew heavier in his hands. Every page another contradiction to the woman he'd watched scrub floors for 3 years. A man in a navy dress uniform appeared in the corridor, his uniform so precisely pressed it looked like it could cut. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Halloway, SEAL Team 3, his presence filling the doorway like someone had dimmed all the other light in the hospital to make him brighter. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched people die and knew the exact caliber of skill required to prevent it. Major Danielle Ross received the Bronze Star with valor. He paused. "Let that sit." She received 2 Silver Stars for tactical field operations under sustained enemy fire. Another pause. The gravity of each medal deserved its own moment. She received the Navy Cross for extracting 12 wounded Marines from a burning field hospital while under direct fire, sustaining shrapnel wounds to her lumbar spine that should have paralyzed her. He stepped into the room. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. That woman right there performed more combat medical miracles in 36 months than most surgeons achieve in a lifetime. The corridor behind him filled with people in suits. Federal investigators. Their badges catching the light like small silver accusations. Behind them, a man Danielle recognized from hospital administration, the Pentagon liaison who'd been watching Oak Creek Memorial for weeks. He moved past Halloway with the kind of authority that made even a Navy SEAL step aside. When he spoke, his words were directed at Dr. Caldwell, who'd appeared at the far end of the corridor, his face the color of old milk. Major Danielle Ross was embedded with JSOC as part of a classified trauma response unit. She held the rank of major throughout her service. Her medical credentials include board certification in trauma surgery from Johns Hopkins, a doctorate in military medical science, and commendations from 4 separate commands. The liaison's eyes locked on Caldwell. "Dr. Caldwell, you just fired a decorated war hero for performing the exact procedure she was trained to perform better than almost anyone in the Marine Corps." Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No words came out. His power had evaporated. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. He was standing in a room with his own career collapsing like a building with cut foundations. Outside the hospital, a CNN news crew was already setting up, a veteran nurse had made an anonymous call, and the story was already spreading like wildfire through social media. Federal investigators emerged from Caldwell's office carrying boxes of files, their faces the careful blank of people who'd found exactly what they were looking for. Insurance fraud. Systematic, calculated, deliberate. Caldwell had been preventing qualified personnel, not just Danielle, but 3 others over 5 years, from performing procedures so he could bill for them himself. Inflated surgical codes. Insurance claims for services rendered by lower-paid staff, billed as if performed by the attending physician. It was elegant. It was criminal. It was worth approximately $847,000 in fraudulent claims. But that wasn't the worst part. When Caldwell agreed to a live television interview that afternoon, believing he could still control the narrative, he sat across from an anchor whose expression suggested she'd been briefed on exactly what he'd done. His voice was smooth, measured, the voice of a man who'd talked his way out of problems before. Ms. Ross is a fine nurse, but she violated every protocol we have. She performed a surgical procedure without authorization, without supervision. What if she had been wrong? The anchor leaned forward. But she wasn't wrong. She saved his life. This time, Caldwell said. But we can't have nurses playing doctor based on. The studio phone line lit up. The anchor touched her earpiece, and something in her expression shifted, a quiet satisfaction that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. We have a caller who says he has direct knowledge of this case. She turned to camera. Sir, you're on the air. The voice that came through the speaker made Caldwell's face drain entirely. Not just pale. Not just concerned. The color of someone watching their life get erased in real time. This is Brigadier General James Keller, USMC. I commanded Major Ross in Sangin. She didn't play doctor, she was a doctor, a trauma surgeon who volunteered for the most dangerous posting in theater. The anchor's smile was almost predatory. General, can you tell us about Major Ross's service? She performed 73 combat surgeries under fire. She held wounded Marines together with her bare hands during mortar attacks. The field hospital took a direct hit, shrapnel through her spine, and she still dragged 12 men from the burning building before she collapsed and spent the next 18 months relearning how to walk. The general's voice didn't waver. Dr. Caldwell fired her for doing exactly what she was trained to do, what she's done better than almost anyone in the Marine Corps. And I'd like to know why a civilian administrator thinks he knows better than the United States military about how to save lives. The phone lines exploded. Millions watching. Caldwell tried to interrupt the anchor. She silenced him with a gesture that carried more authority than his entire career. The Pentagon liaison stood beside the camera crew that had now arrived at Oak Creek Memorial, speaking to reporters with the careful precision of someone delivering a verdict. Dr. Caldwell has been systematically preventing qualified personnel from performing procedures so he could bill for them himself. Major Ross wasn't the first skilled provider he sidelined. She was just the first one who couldn't stay quiet when a life was at stake. 6 months later, Danielle stood in the Chief of Surgery's office at Oak Creek Memorial, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the parking lot below. Through the glass, visible at a folding table in the strip mall parking lot across the street, Dr. Caldwell sat selling cut-rate insurance policies. His medical license revoked. His reputation destroyed. His power converted to nothing. The new chief, a former Army surgeon, handed her a white coat. Oakley's pinned to the collar. The rank insignia catching light like a small bronze promise. Your operating privileges are fully reinstated, Major. We've also created a position for you training residents in trauma procedures. The hospital board would like to recommend you for their leadership council. David stood in the doorway in his dress blues. Commander Hayes beside him, fully recovered, the broken chain replaced with a new one holding both his dog tag and Danielle's twin. She wore hers now without hiding it. The floor nurses who'd once smirked at quiet little Dania now straightened when she entered a room. Kelly had printed and framed Danielle's commendations, hanging them in the ICU break room where everyone would see them. That evening, in the trauma bay, Danielle taught a shaking resident the same chest seal technique that had saved a Marine commander's life, her voice calm and certain. You have the training. Trust your hands. The resident's hands steadied under the weight of her belief in them. This was the real power. Not titles. Not authority. the ability to make someone trust what they were capable of becoming. When she walked to her car, a young Marine with a medical transport uniform stopped her, saluted without thinking, "Are you Angel 6? She took one measured breath, no tears this time, just the quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd never stopped being who she was trained to be. I was. Now I'm just a nurse who knows how to save lives. She drove past the strip mall where Caldwell sat at his folding table in the fading light, and she felt nothing, no anger, no triumph, just the clean certainty of knowing the truth had held weight in the end. At home, David helped her hang her military portrait beside his in the hallway, the Major's insignia visible and undeniable. Commander Hayes had written a letter recommending her for the hospital's board of directors. Her phone buzzed with a text from the General, "Welcome back to the fight, Angel 6. The final moment, Danielle in the operating room, hand steady, saving another life, while on the wall behind her a plaque read what had been true all along. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, hit subscribe. If you believe the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most powerful, like this video and comment below, tell us about a time you were wrong about someone. And if you know a nurse, a veteran, or anyone carrying a secret strength they've never gotten credit for, share this story with them. They'll understand what we're really talking about.